It's time to get going. If everyone can find their seats, we'll get started. All right, we'll call back to order the Nevada Board of Wildlife Commissioners meeting. We took recess in the middle of item number 7. We had a motion that was approved 9-0 to approve the elk subplan. Associated with that was a recommendation to approve the initial members of the Humboldt County Elk Subplan COP team. That list of members is, I believe, page 2 in the support material, but I'll simply go through the list. The members and who they're representing. Kevin Gallio will be representing General Sportsman. Lyle Avey will be representing the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. Tony Gildone will be representing the Humboldt Cat. Mike Sperry will be representing farming. Hank Dufresne will be representing a BLM permitted rancher. Tom Casanelli will be representing the U.S. Forest Service permitted rancher. Ron Cherry will be representing the Humboldt County Commission. David Campworth will be representing the BLM. Boyd Hatch, the Forest Service. Brian Day, Fish and Wildlife Service. And Mr. Ed Partee will be representing the Department of Wildlife. Mr. Partee, is there anything I missed on that? And just to reiterate, these members were recommended by the sub-planning committee?
Yes, for the record, Ed Partee. Yes, these were all recommended by the subcommittee, and most of the members on this list were on the subcommittee. That way the thought on that was that everybody was abreast of what has been taking place with the plan. The only addition that we have is Mr. Tony Gildone for the Humboldt County Commission CAB, because he was not on the original committee.
Right.
And then the other addition is one of the BLM representatives, but they've had such an influx of change over there. I think we've seen 3 different people come through that. So, but yeah.
Okay. Questions of Mr. Partee? All right, seeing none, since we didn't take comments specific to this, I'm going to open it up. Is there any county advisory board input on the makeup of the COP members? Public comment, Reno? Public comment in Elko?
No comment in Elko.
And Las Vegas?
No comment in Las Vegas.
Okay. That'll bring it back to the commission. If there's no further questions or discussion, I would entertain a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I would move that we approve the recommendations for the Humboldt County Elk Subplan COP members as presented.
Second.
Okay, I have a motion by Commissioner Wallace, a second by Commissioner Morai to approve the Humboldt County Elk Subplan COP members as presented and recommended by the committee. Are there any questions or discussion on the motion? If not, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries unanimously 9-0. Now we will close item number 7 and we'll open item number 8. Nevada Department of Wildlife project updates. Secretary Tony Bosley. This is informational. The Commission has requested that the Department provide regular project updates for ongoing projects and programs as appropriate based on geography and timing of meetings. These updates are intended to provide detail in addition to that provided during the Department report. How's that for winging me in?
Perfect.
Director Bosley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the March Commission meeting on March 25th in Yerington, you heard a brief update pertaining to the Blue Ribbon panel, its recommendations. The Diversity Division Administrator, Jennifer Newmark, myself, and Commissioner McNitch had traveled back to Washington, D.C. In conjunction with the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon panel, and the Commission had expressed a desire to get a little bit deeper into detail, a little bit more thorough update. So today, Jennifer and I will kind of walk you through what the Blue Ribbon panel is and some of the specific recommendations that have come forward from the panel. Just a little bit of a background. There's been a national discussion on funding wildlife conservation, increasing the funding for wildlife conservation for decades. There's been a number of attempts at securing broader funding over the last 20 years. The mid-90s was an effort called Teaming with Wildlife that tried to levy an excise tax on outdoor equipment, for example, backpacks and binoculars, to try to broaden that funding base beyond the traditional consumptive constituents through tag and license revenues. And that effort failed. There was a Conservation and Reinvestment Act looking at offshore oil revenues, and that was abbreviated into the Conservation and Reinvestment Act Light. In September of 14, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies launched the Blue Ribbon Panel. I've got PowerPoint here. What's tied to the Blue Ribbon Panel is Wildlife Action Plan. And so what we'll do in this presentation is kind of talk about what the Blue Ribbon Panel is and how that relates to the State Wildlife Action Plan. So, can we get it on this one? Is that something we can do? Okay, that's fine. You're going to make me read my notes. That's okay.
What, your eyesight's not good enough to do that little?
So the federal funding history, what we have right now, the Pitt-Robertson Act from 1937, 1950, Dingell-Johnson Act, 1984 Wallet-Burrow Amendment, that generates approximately $1 billion annually, and that's primarily used for game and sport fisheries. In 2001, the state and tribal wildlife grants showed up on the scene, and that provides approximately $50 million annually. What we see as a result of the state tribal wildlife grant is approximately $800,000 annually. So it provides critical support for some species, but not enough to effectively manage all the species. And so we look at our funding model. What we have now is, if you were to look strictly at hunting and license sales, and we look at the number of individuals purchasing licenses, we combine hunting and fishing licenses, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 2.5% of our citizens that are purchasing tags, licenses, and that 2.5% of our citizens provide the state match that then gets federal dollars, and those federal dollars are generated through federal excise tax. So the vast majority of our budget comes from 2 to 2.5% of our citizens, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 8% of our species that we actually generate revenue from. So we're tasked with generating revenue from 7 or 8% of our species and 2 to 2.5% of our citizens to fulfill our statutory charge to manage 892 species, the other 92% of the species for the other 98% of the citizens. And so this challenge it's not unique to Nevada. Different states have different strategies in play. The Nevada Department of Wildlife receives less than 2% of our annual budget from general fund appropriations. So the funding challenge exists in other states, and as I said, other states have some different strategies, but it's not unique to Nevada. It's a national problem. So in September of 14, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies launched the Blue Ribbon Panel, and the Blue Ribbon Panel. The charge was to recommend a mechanism to sustainably fund the conservation of all fish and wildlife. So the national co-chairs are Johnny Morris, the founder of Bass Pro Shops, and former Governor of Wyoming, Dave Friedenthal. The two chairs brought together 26 business and conservation leaders who met 3 times in 2015 and released their recommendations this past March in Washington, D.C. And it was the release of those recommendations that Commissioner McNitch, myself, and Jennifer Newmark attended. The membership of the Blue Ribbon Panel includes many of the top leaders in conservation and business. They all share a commitment to conserving our nation's fish and wildlife resources for the next generation to enjoy. And I want to run through the makeup of that just so you understand how diverse it was and the level of the people that participated in that. Kevin Butt, who's the Regional Environmental Director for Toyota. Richard Childress, the CEO of Richard Childress Racing of NRA fame. Jeff Crane, the President of Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation. Bruce Culpepper, the Executive Vice President of Shell Americas. John Dewar, the President and CEO of Pure Fishing. Jim Falstich, Vice Chair for Partners for Conservation and a rancher. John Fitzpatrick, the Director of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Greg Hill, President, COO of Hess Corporation. Becky Humphreys, Executive Vice President of the National Wild Turkey Federation. Stephen Keller, Professor Emeritus at Yale. Jennifer Mole, CEO of Backwoods Incorporated and President of the Outdoor Industry Association. John Newman, Board Member of Ducks Unlimited. Mike Neusman, President, CEO of American Sport Fishing Association. Margaret O'Gorman, the President of the Wildlife Habitat Council. Glenn Olson, Public Policy Chair of the National Audubon Society. Colin O'Mara, the President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation. Connie Parker, the CEO of CS Pear Group and the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership Board. Charlie Potter, CEO of Max McGraw Wildlife Foundation. Steve Santini, the President and CEO of the National Shooting Sports Foundation. John Tomke, the Chair of Wildlife and Hunting Heritage Conservation Council. Jeff Trandle, CEO of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. James Walker, Board Member from the American Wind Wildlife Institute. Steve Williams, President of the Wildlife Management Institute, former Director of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and former Director of Kansas Parks and Wildlife. And lastly, Bob Zemer, who was the only director of the 50 states that sat on the panel, and he's the director for the Missouri Department of Conservation. So a very diverse group, a very motivated group, high-level group, met multiple times. So the panel basically looked for funding options that supported conservation for at-risk species and habitats as prioritized in the State Wildlife Action Plan. And in a second, I'll turn it over to Jennifer to talk about what that State Wildlife Action Plan is and how it was integral in the recommendations that came forward. They wanted to have a dedicated source of funding, something that was sustainable, not reliant on an annual appropriation. As we look at these programs that rely on annual appropriations, it's a fight every year to get things included in the budget. They wanted to have a dedicated, reliable, sustainable source of funding. Wanted it to be new and or supplement the source of funding that completes the wildlife conservation model. So the wildlife conservation model, you hear a lot of talk about the North American model. The North American model for wildlife conservation has been incredibly effective. The challenges that we have are some of the issues that I already mentioned, where you have a small percentage of your population base and a small percentage of your species generating the revenue and the funding to conserve the balance of the species for the balance of the citizens. Some of the criteria for funding, back up here, they wanted to make sure that it supported conservation of at-risk fish and wildlife and their habitats, and it was an execution of the State Wildlife Action Plan, that it was sustained, not reliant on the annual appropriation, as I already said, sufficient to achieve success. The state survey estimated the funding need to be $1.3 billion annually. That's nationally, and I'll explain in a second how they arrived at $1.3 billion. We wanted it to be a long-term, minimum of 10 years, and renewable, achievable within 5 years. Expand the contributor base beyond hunters, anglers, recreational shooters, and motorized boaters who pay fees and licenses, and the industry contributing through excise tax. So they wanted it to be more than that, more inclusive. Let's have more people pay for the conservation of wildlife. They wanted it to be used to support conservation education and nature-based recreation, as well as species and habitat conservation. So with the present model, there's some limitations to how we can use the funding in education arenas. Part of the thought is that we need to become more involved with educate public to better understand the value of conservation. So they wanted to have some flexibility in how that money could be spent. It can be administered efficiently to assure a high return on investment, distributed equitably to and directed by state fish and wildlife agencies. So we wanted it to be similar to Sport Fish and Wildlife Restoration Fund in empowering the states to direct its expenditure. And they wanted it to be national in scope and not require legislative action by individual states. They didn't want it to be hung up in state legislatures and requiring legislative changes in order to make it happen. So, although the excise taxes have been hugely successful for game and sport fish, the panel decided that the model did not work for funding for the rest of wildlife. There was little support for a new tax, and at the end of the day, there were just too few products that tied directly to wildlife, bird feeding, supplies, binoculars, etc., to raise enough funding. Similarly, corporate giving proved not to be a viable option because it would require new infrastructure to support, would require marketing and fundraising, and was undedicated, and reliable funding wouldn't necessarily be the direct result. So ultimately, it was decided that energy and mineral royalties were the best option. The energy and mineral royalties from federal lands and waters would direct and dedicate existing source of revenue, be sufficient revenue available, but would require offsets. The funds are now mostly unrestricted to pay for government services, would ensure future generations benefit from the extraction of non-renewable resources, and its industry supported. So the federal government collected $12.2 billion in royalties, fees, and bonus bids in 2013 from companies that extract energy and mineral resources from federal lands and waters. A relatively small amount is dedicated to other purposes like the Land and Water Conservation Fund and revenue sharing with other states. But the majority of this funding is used by Congress to fund other government services. So with having organizations like Shell and Hess Oil sit on this panel, they liked this idea. They supported it. They supported the funding as their royalties were always meant to help offset their environmental impacts of doing business. So right now, those royalties go into this large fund that then is somehow spread across a number of programs. Nobody at this point can really follow dollar for dollar where they're going, but industry likes the idea that those royalties would go directly to conservation and offset those impacts and hopefully provide them some business certainty going forward. So the funding target was to implement state wildlife action plans. So I said I'd speak to the source, the genesis of the $1.3 billion. The question that the team asked, the panel asked, was how much money do we need to conserve these other species? And the concept of, well, let's look at the state wildlife action plans. What are these state wildlife action plans? How much would it cost to implement them? And what is, what should be the federal portion of that? So they looked at all the 50 states wildlife action plans, determined what the cost of implementation would be, and then took 75% of that, assuming the funding mechanism would be similar to wildlife restoration funds, the 3-to-1 match, and determined that $1.3 billion is 75% of the amount that would be required to implement 100% of the state wildlife action plans. And they said that should be the federal share, and the states should be able to cough up, figure out how to get the other 25% to match that. So for Nevada, what that means for us is we would go from roughly $800,000 a year in conservation funding towards implementation of our state wildlife action plan and those priority species to nearly $20.5 million a year. So it certainly would be some challenges coming up with the non-federal portion of that, but it's a significant amount of money towards implementation of our state wildlife action plan. I guess some of the key points is that the funding would function in the same way as a state wildlife grant. So it's taking advantage of existing infrastructure. It wouldn't have to create new infrastructure. The apportionment is based on 1/3 of the state's land area and 2/3 of the state population. Similar formula proportionalizing federal excise tax. And the funding would be administered through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So again, you're taking advantage of the existing infrastructure, and it would be funneled through the same way that we get our sport fish and wildlife restoration funds. The challenge, though, it does have the match requirement, the 25%. So in order to get $20.5 million for implementation of the State Wildlife Action Plan, we would have to figure out some way to come up with $6-7 million-ish, our 25%. Certainly, we use volunteers to a significant benefit to the state. Some of our programs, the Guzzler program, pays for itself just with the in-kind match of the volunteer. We were able to get that entire 25% of the state portion through in-kind match of volunteers. So there are some creative ways, but when you talk about an amount, $6 or $7 million, you have to get a little bit more creative. So the recommendation 1 from the Blue Ribbon Panel, these recommendations came out in March again, that Congress dedicate up to $1.3 billion annually in existing revenue from the development of energy and mineral resources on federal lands and waters to the Wildlife Conservation Restoration Program. Recommendation number 2, that the Blue Ribbon Panel will examine the impact of societal changes on the relevancy of fish and wildlife conservation and make recommendations on how programs and agencies can transform to engage and serve broader constituencies. So this is an issue that Johnny Morris, again, the founder and CEO of Bass Pro Shots, has been passionate about for at least 20 years. And I had the opportunity to talk with Johnny back in D.C. a little bit, and he asked how Willie Malini was doing, the former director of the department, and apparently he and Willie had worked together 20 years ago on the Teaming with Wildlife effort. And as somebody who owns an outdoor product industry at Bass Pro, he understands how much his business is reliant on outdoor recreation and effective conservation. So he's been a proponent of conservation for a long time, brings a lot of great energy and enthusiasm to this panel. I think there's one last point I want to make before I turn it over to Jen to discuss the Wildlife Action Plan and what that action plan is, so you have a better understanding what we're talking about when we talk about using potentially using federal funding to implement the Wildlife Action Plan. The last point is currently there's a key Republican and a key Democratic champion who plan to introduce legislation this spring based on the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Panel. There is broad bipartisan support for this issue. There's great industry support, key people with key connections, and despite the fact that this conversation has been ongoing for at least 2 decades, I think that there's a heightened sense of optimism that I don't think anybody has previously had. So we too are optimistic. I know Commissioner McNitch has participated in several of the fly-in events through the years in D.C. and in March, the Teaming with Wildlife, these fly-in events to heighten awareness of some of the challenges of funding conservation. And I think he would say that the sense of optimism of others as well as himself is much greater than he's historically seen. But with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer to discuss what the Wildlife Action Plan is and some of the key parts of that we would hope to implement.
Good morning. Jennifer Newmark. I'm the Diversity Division Administrator. And since the Blue Ribbon Panel recommendations are tied to implementation of our statewide action plan, we thought that it would be a good idea to talk a little bit about the plan today and give you a little bit of an idea about what's included in the plan and what we're doing already in Nevada to implement the plan. So it is called the Wildlife Action Plan, and it's... Oh, thanks. Sorry.
No, I forgot.
So it is a plan of action, and I think that word action is really important because it's not just a plan of what we think we should maybe do someday. It's not something that sits on our shelf. It's something that we refer to in almost all the things that we do, and it is really meant to target comprehensive wildlife conservation in Nevada. And I should just point out that it's not just non-game species. So we also are addressing native fishes, mollusks, priority game species, such as sage grouse, and we also address priority habitats within the plan. So our first plan was approved in 2005. At that point, it was a requirement of all states to have a wildlife action plan. And in 2011, we decided that we needed to revise our plan to address emerging and expanding stressors such as climate change, invasive species, and new and emerging diseases. Our new and revised plan was approved in 2012. Most states are just submitting their revised plan now, so I'll just brag just a little bit that Nevada was one of the first ones to get our revision in, and our state plan actually served as a model for a lot of the other states. So what does the Wildlife Action Plan do? Broadly, its goals are to keep common species common and to address species that are declining before they become so imperiled that they're federally listed. It's meant to be proactive rather than reactive, and it's based on collaboration and partnerships. Through the state wildlife grants, we're leveraging our state funding with federal funding. So for every dollar that the state spends, we get almost $3 in federal funding. And most importantly, it's a blueprint for protecting our wildlife resources for future generations. So we all know that we're incredibly lucky to live in Nevada. Our state is so diverse in both the amounts of wildlife that call it home and also in our types of habitat. And in fact, Nevada is ranked 11th in overall diversity among the 50 states. And we're 6th in the number of endemic species. Those are those species that are found here and nowhere else. We have 173 of them. Unfortunately, in terms of species at risk, we're also ranked 3. So our abundant and rich wildlife resources, they're a result of our unique geological past and also our current geography. We're the most mountainous state in the union, and we have all these isolated habitats that have created unique species. And a lot of that creates some challenging management issues, and that's what our Wildlife Action Plan addresses. Because there are so many species in Nevada, we couldn't possibly work on all of them at the same time, so we needed to prioritize the species that we would focus on. And we did this through a scoring matrix, and in that scoring matrix, we addressed factors such as federally and state endangered species. We looked at species that had declining trends. We analyzed species with restricted ranges, and especially those that had limited habitat types. Species that had serious habitat concerns became a priority. And we also looked at those species that Nevada holds a significant responsibility for the management of their global population. So a significant portion of their global range would occur in the state, and we addressed those species as well. And finally, we included species that were high management priorities for the state. The result is 256 species of greatest conservation need. This is approximately 30% of the 892 species that occur in Nevada. It's a broad group that crosses all the taxonomic groups, and it's not just non-game species. So I mentioned that before, but bighorn sheep, mule deer, Lahontan cutthroat trout, sage grouse, these are all priority species within the plan. In addition to some of the non-game species such as pygmy rabbits and Great Basin collared lizards and different species of bats. So even though we think of the Wildlife Action Plan sometimes as a diversity division plan, it really is meant to be holistic in nature, and it cuts across all the work that the department works on. Our priority species are connected to key habitat types. We have 22 of them in the state. Some examples of these include marshes, wet meadows, woodlands such as aspen woodlands, alpine and tundra. And each of these key habitats and species sections of the plans have objectives and actions, things that we are going to actively do to address the concerns with those species or those habitats. So for example, in our lakes and reservoir key habitat type, some of our objectives include improving water quality, removing invasive species, or maintaining priority bird species in stable or increasing trends. That was a mouthful. So we, along with our partners, are now implementing as much of the plan as our limited resources allow. You often hear in our reports to the Commission different activities that the Diversity Division has been doing. Things like pulling mine claim markers to eliminate threats to cavity nesting birds, improving or protecting different habitat types, or even some of our specific species studies like our Golden Eagle satellite tracking project. But I just want to point out that these efforts are not diversity divisions alone. All of the NDOW divisions are working on implementing this plan. So fisheries is doing critical work on native fishes and amphibians. Habitat is, of course, doing habitat enhancement and restoration work. Con Ed is helping us by doing education work and connecting people with nature. We're all working together to implement this plan, and we're not just doing it by ourselves. We're also working with our federal partners, with NGOs, private landowners, and the general public. And truly, I feel like that collaboration, that partnership is the key to the success of conserving our wildlife. We're a big state, we have a lot of diversity, and we can't do it alone. A great example of this is the Columbia spotted frog. This species became a candidate for federal listing in 1993. It's found throughout the West, and it occurs in 2 different areas of Nevada, one in the Northeast that's connected to other populations in the West, and then we have this isolated population in central Nevada that's not connected to any of the other populations. There is a diverse group of stakeholders that came together and created a conservation strategy and agreement. It was signed in 2005 and then renewed again in 2015. And in this agreement, we've all agreed that we're going to work together to monitor the populations every year. We've put in habitat improvement projects. We've even tracked individual frog movements so we can understand how they're using the landscape. And the result of all of that was that we were able to document that the species is actually on a steady recovery. It's increasing. And the Fish and Wildlife Service earlier this year determined that it was not warranted to list the species because of all the work that we had been doing on it. So I believe that with broad implementation of our wildlife action plan, success stories like the spotted frog can be our normal. We can achieve good conservation of all the species that occur in the state. And if the Blue Ribbon Panel recommendations are implemented, we'll have a better opportunity to understand all of those 892 species that call Nevada home. We can work on understanding how they're using their habitat and therefore be more effective in how we preserve their habitat. We can broaden our education and nature tourism, and we can really connect people with nature and conserve our species for all the future generations. So on that really positive note, I do also have to point out that there is a challenge in front of us, and that is going to be how we come up with our 25% match. And Director Wassley has already mentioned that, but that is going to be an area where I think we have to be creative and we have to start thinking about how to broaden our constituency and think about our citizens and how we all play a role in conserving our wildlife. That's all I have. Do you have any more, or we can answer questions?
Comments or questions for Director Wadsley or Ms. Newmark? Commissioner McNish?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know I'd have some comments, so.
Anticipated.
You know, there's no question to ask to draw anything else out. You guys did an awesome job of throwing it out there, but, you know, the longer I'm on the commission, the more I realize the importance. You know, we sit in here and we talk a lot about real specific things, and the one thing that we haven't had the opportunity to do is talk about this kind of stuff. This is, I mean, this is, it's not, it goes beyond groundbreaking. I mean, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity, and you know, the Pittman Robertson stuff 75 years ago, and you know, it's still functioning today. And, you know, there have been attempts at this that have fallen just short by a little bit. But the opportunity here goes way beyond any of our lives, anybody in this room. I mean, this has the potential to affect many generations after us. And to me, it's really becoming the single most important thing that we can engage in. And I'm talking about at the commission level, too. And we really want to do something. We really want to move the needle. This is it. It's not about pioneering elk. It's not about, you know, it's not about those types of opportunities. I mean, this is how you move the needle. Is this type of stuff right here? So that means we gotta find a way to work through having others at the table. They're already at the table. Okay, there's concerns there. We have to find a way to engage with our legislature to get that state match in place, and now's the time to start talking about that and get this in place. This thing's probably got a great chance of happening. It's as good a shot as there ever has been, and we're not talking pennies here. We're not talking about dropping coins in a at a shopping, at a grocery store, putting coins into a little box and adding them up at the end of the day, and that they make a difference. This is real money here. This is big, and I'm hoping that at some point in the very near future that we can engage in a conversation as a commission to maybe start talking about a legislative package to put something together. Engaging that 98% of the people in the state of Nevada that we hear about every meeting about how 98%, 98%. Well, here's our opportunity to get all 98% of them involved in a meaningful way, and we shouldn't have any problem finding our state match if that's the case. I suspect that it's a bigger challenge than that, but with all those people out there, this shouldn't be that big of a deal to make happen, and I really want to engage at that level. It's really important. It's the biggest thing that we're going to see.
What tax are you proposing, Dave?
I'm not proposing a tax, but I think that's the point. These guys sat down, and being in the room, understanding the personalities of the two co-chair people, they couldn't be polar opposites in how they handle things. They really couldn't. I don't know if I'm missing the mark on that. You kind of have this loud, vociferous type on one side. You have this kind of calm, quiet, calm demeanor guy on the other. And between the two of them, they've already moved the needle in some respect by drawing attention to this. And quietly, they've gotten people to support it in Congress, and it does have bipartisan support, and it is going to move. So if they can get things moving, certainly we can find a way to get things moving. And we're talking about going from $30 million a year, 21. What's the
as a total agency budget, just shy of 40 to 60. So percentage of the overall budget would be significant.
50% increase. It's insane. So I don't know. I'd be willing to pay a tax for it personally.
So would I. It takes
But
money.
it doesn't have to be that, of course. But there's got to be a way.
Additional comments or questions?
And I appreciate what Director Wasley and what Jen have done participating at that level. There's not, hopefully there will be, but there's not a lot of directors went, not a lot of chiefs went, to the meeting. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have the attention. It just means that there was extra effort put in on this end, and I appreciate it.
Commissioner McNinch? Additional comments or questions? No? Commissioner Hubbs?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jen. You did great work, and Director Mosley, I'm impressed with your work overall, and especially that your Wildlife Action Plan was the keystone plan. I think that speaks a lot about your dedication to your jobs and highlighting our state here in the Great Basin. That's wonderful. But I wanted to know what was kind of on my mind was the surveys that you were doing, Director Wasley, for wildlife. We talked about it a little bit at our last commission meeting, and if we're honing in on possible revenue sources from those surveys.
Thank you, Commissioner Hubbs. The survey that we provided a brief update on in March was America's Wildlife Values Survey. It's a survey that was conducted in 2004. And the survey drives a lot of national discussion, and it's a survey that's a complete cross-section of society. It isn't hunters or anglers or trappers. It is society, all of society, and it drives a lot of the national discussions as far as things like relevance, conservation. It was conducted in 2004, and the idea is there's been 12 years pass, and this is a time to re-administer the same survey and determine direction and magnitude of change, if there is any, in societal views. And the results from that survey, I believe, may provide a little insight into possible funding sources if you know how people think or feel about conservation. But it isn't the intent of that survey to identify funding streams. I don't know that revenue is really as big of a question in that survey as relevance of conservation of fish and wildlife agencies. So what we've recently learned is that we will be the first state in which the survey is administered. We'll see raw data perhaps in the fall, and then the complete summary, the complete report won't be compiled until after next year, into next year. And when you look at the survey results from 2004, it's 318 pages. It looks like the Las Vegas phone book. So it kind of speaks to the effort in summarizing all that data. And then there's individual state breakouts. And it's certainly something that we'll share with the Commission and anybody else who's interested in that. That survey is something that will take place whether or not we support or condone. It is a national effort. However, we have the opportunity to add additional questions to that survey. There are additional tiers that we can add, identify management issues, and add additional questions that we can take advantage of an existing survey structure and effort to learn a little bit. And we've suggested a couple management issues to be added to that. And those issues included dealing with urban wildlife, strategies to deal with urban wildlife, some questions surrounding the bear hunt as the recommendations that came out of the hunt committee, the bear hunt committee. Also a question pertaining to where people get their information, and more specifically where they get their information and news about conservation, so we can begin to develop messages and deliver messages to specific strata that have an interest in conservation. We can take advantage of that existing interest in conservation and communicate with them as constituents. So there was a fourth issue that escapes me right now, but we have an opportunity to add that, and we thought it would be a cost savings to take advantage of an existing survey and add a couple additional questions. But it's not directly tied to this, but it should provide some insight.
Additional questions or comments? I had a comment and then maybe followed by a question, but in my day job, which I'm clearly not at today, I use the State Wildlife Action Plan recently almost on a daily basis, and I find it to be overwhelming, informative, and a very useful tool. So Jen, to you and your staff and everyone who's working on it, I just want to express my appreciation and encourage people to really dive into that, because you'll find some really fascinating facts, and I think you'll discover how overwhelming the challenge of all wildlife conservation is within the state of Nevada. And I think there's a trend for people to both understand that and want to do something about that, and I have no problem helping to push and lead that trend. So if there's something that you need from this commission that can help in those efforts, I'm willing to do that. And then the question I would have is, you had mentioned some of the funding mechanisms, or the funding estimates, I guess, in terms of funding 75% of the nationwide wildlife action plan. So the number that came from Nevada, I'm trying to get my arms around how you would even begin estimating the implementation of the action plan. But maybe was that a department activity, was that a panel, was that a combination of the two?
So the number for Nevada is based on the formula that is based on 1/3 of our land and 2/3 of the species. So that's where that number comes in. And then when I'm going to say when, not if, when we get our 20 million, I think it will be a really I think it'll be a department-wide strategic approach of how we're going to be looking at implementing that.
Okay, so the Nevada portion, they basically did a nationwide estimate on what it would take to implement all the plans, and then
that's
back
the
it out through the
1.3.
formula.
Yep.
Okay. Additional comments or questions? Right.
I have one more
Oh,
question.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Hubbs.
So just to get this straight, you have a complete wildlife action plan.
Correct.
And it's based off of receiving the 20 million to date. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct. Actually, our wildlife action plan is based on the management needs of the conservation of our species. So it's irrelevant what the funding mechanisms are behind it. It was a scientific and collaborative approach at looking at the species that have the greatest conservation need within the state, and then creating action items on how we can address those conservation needs. So right now we get funding from state wildlife grants and approximately $800,000. So we're implementing just a small portion. Obviously, if we get $20 million, we'll be able to implement much bigger portions of the wildlife action plan. And that was the analysis that the Blue Ribbon panel really looked at, that, across the country, all states are implementing only a tiny portion of their wildlife action plans because the funding just doesn't support anything more than that. And so how they came up with that 1.3 billion is saying, okay, if we were to implement 75% of those wildlife action plans, how much money would that be? And then came up with 1.3 billion. And then to divvy up the 1.3 billion, they use the formulas that state wildlife grants already are using, and that's how we get to the 20 million for Nevada.
Okay, thank you.
It's the existence of that state wildlife action plan that makes us eligible for the state wildlife grants. Right now, we wouldn't be eligible for those federal dollars absent that plan. So its origin was tied to the opportunity for those federal funds, which pale in comparison to what we're talking about here.
Additional comments or questions? All right. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you guys. I have a little bit of literature I'll leave with you because I know you don't have enough.